The other case is India, where martial law had been declared to try and dampen down the growing enthusiasm around the Indian National Congress. This was the moment where Gandhi was becoming a particular force in India. But at Amritsar, there was a very important Punjabi festival taking place, and the man on the spot, General Reginald Dyer, believed that martial law had to be imposed, even though this was a religious cultural festival, and organized a series of soldiers to go into the closed conditions of this big walled park place, and shoot at the assembled people. Over 1,500 rounds of ammunition were fired to a crowd that had no weapons. It lasted for about 10 minutes. Dyer made sure that the main exit was blocked so that people couldn't get out. Many people were shot in the back, women and children killed as well. There were over 1,000 dead. Now, Reginald Dyer becomes both a hero and a villain. And if you read the debate in the House of Commons, you'll get a flavour of that. Many people, including, in fairness, Winston Churchill, obviously the Labour Party, were appalled, were totally appalled by this barbaric use of violence. But many people believed that Dyer had basically done the right thing and that he had imposed the rule of law. Indeed, the Morning Post, which becomes the Daily Telegraph, it merges with the Daily Telegraph, launched a subscription campaign to raise funds for Dyer, who's court-martialed and forced into retirement. They raised £26,000 for him to aid his retirement. So Dyer is in no way a pariah. There are certainly people who believe that it was utterly the wrong thing, but there were many others who thought what this was entirely a necessary process. Last example is Iraq. The very strange alliance of the figure of Winston Churchill and T.E. Lawrence come up with, I mean, there are other people involved, but they're the key players, come up with this idea that the only way to patrol and police Iraq, which was now, part of Britain's empire, was to do it by so-called air control. Okay? This is the beginning of the strategy that the US used so ineffectively in both Gulf Wars. The idea was that using aeroplanes, you could cover the great areas of desert that you couldn't possibly get troops to quickly enough, and that you could police the nomadic groups that frustratingly refused to stay in one place so that they could be more effectively policed. And the idea was that just the sign of an aeroplane flying very low, but particularly the occasional use of machine gun fire and bombs were meant to have a moral effect on the population, to make sure that people were totally overwhelmed and frightened and disorientated, to instill the British authority. One of the men who was part of this group was Arthur Harris, who then became known as Bomber Harris during the Second World War and was responsible for the saturation bombing of Germany and Dresden in particular. So a whole series of quite different forms of repression in different contexts. So the fist was one strategy, the olive branch was another. And just as after the revolt in 1857, Britain begins to introduce a series of slow, partial reforms. So in India, you get the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms that allows the beginning of representative self-government in the provinces, especially. In Ireland, you get the negotiations that culminate in the Anglo-Irish Treaty and the establishment of the Irish Free State. In Egypt, is always a mess because it's sort of hard to account for the different forms of Britain's formal and informal control, but Britain basically hands off formal control in 1922. There'd been a revolution in Egypt in 1919. They also build, in probably the most important thing that I've talked about today, they build Wembley Stadium, the home of the English football team, the most sanctified spot in the entire United Kingdom. They build a Wembley Stadium in 1924 to host the Imperial Conference, the theme of which was unity in independence. Okay? The idea was a shift towards a new rhetoric of empire, of not simply Britain's overwhelming authority, but of cooperation, of a family of nations. And this was a rhetoric that was going to become very important in the 30s and 40s and into the Commonwealth in the 1950s. Part of this process was also the passing of the Statute of Westminster that gave the Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the right to, I mean, they'd had the de facto right for a while, but it was the final thing that they no longer had to follow the laws of the mother parliament in Britain itself. And there's a bunch of other things that happens in terms of the economics of empire that I'll talk to you about next week. I'm going to skip very quickly so I have time to do the midterm thing with you. The point that I'm trying to make here is that culturally and politically, one response to the wartime was an attempt to restabilize Britain around an idea of England and of English culture. You see that very, very clearly in Stanley Baldwin's address that you can read online, you know, where he talks about the characteristics of the English people and the nature of England being rooted essentially in the countryside. Okay, and I've talked to you about it in terms of the home, the countryside, and conservative politics. The point that I want to make, and I think that the empire makes very well, is the very fragility of this quest for stability and order. And so we return to this dilemma that people faced after the war. Were they trying to restore that old system? Were they trying to build something new? Okay, and I'll pick that up next Tuesday.